Good morning. My name is Amber Kraft. I'm in the Education and Public Programs Office here at the National Archives. It is my honor to welcome those of you here in the theater and those of you watching from online to this year's Right Stuff program. The Archives has a very important job to preserve, protect, and make accessible the valuable records of the federal government. An important way that we do this is making those available to researchers. And you're going to learn a little bit more about what happens with some of that research in just a few minutes. If you haven't already, I hope you take the time to visit the Rotunda and see the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and as well as explore all of the other amazing documents in the rest of our museum. Before we get started, I also want to mention to you a quick sampling of some of our other upcoming programs that we invite you to come back and enjoy. For adults, please come back and join us here in the theater for an upcoming noon book talk or one of our evening programs. You can also sign up for some hands-on adult workshops. July, we have one on sundials, or our June or August escape rooms. Those are all our fun upcoming adult programs. For families, we have learning labs in June and July, where you can take on the role of archivists and researchers and learn a little bit more about doing research at the National Archives. And of course, you don't want to miss the 4th of July here. It's just like Christmas at the National Archives, having the Declaration of Independence. We have a reading of that document on our steps out front, and then lots of activities and reenactors that will be here in the museum on the 4th. July 9th through 13th, kids 12 and up can come and explore their genealogy with our genealogy camp for kids. And these are just a few of the things that we have. So if you check back in the back of our theater, we have handouts that say all the other fun things on our calendar of events. You're able to support great programs like these by joining our National Archives Foundation. At the end of this program, we invite you to give us your feedback. Let us know what you think. You have two ways to do that. One is the QR code and website on the bottom of your programs, or through the evaluation that you got when you came into the room. Also, please join us this afternoon up in the Boeing Learning Center from 1:30 to 4 o'clock for more from today's authors, hands-on activities, book signing, and other great fun. Now, are you guys ready? Yes. All right. I am honored to introduce Zachary Clark, the Executive Director of 826 DC, who will be facilitating our conversation this morning with some truly fantastic authors. Please give them a nice, warm, round welcome.
Hi, everyone. How you doing today? Good. Good. Thanks for being here. I am so excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm so grateful to the National Archives for bringing us all together with such talented writers to talk about stories and research and how to tell them ethically and thoughtfully. So I would like to introduce our authors today, and we'll talk a little bit about where we're coming from and also open up the conversation to any questions you might have. So bring them to the conversation if you're willing. I'd like to introduce all of our authors to come join me on the stage. Brian Floca, Christopher Paul Curtis. Yes, please give them a round of applause. Jim Murphy and Jennifer Choldenko. Thank you all. It's so comfortable and bright up here.
It is nice.
So by way of introductions, I suppose I should introduce myself. I am Zachary Clark, and I serve as the Executive Director of 826 DC. We are the local affiliate here in the district of a national writing organization that teaches writing that is imaginative and rigorous in schools around the country and also publishes youth stories. So our most recent book is called Spitfire. It's a book of poems written by very talented poets at the Seed School of Washington, D.C. You can find out more about it on our website at 826dc.org and get involved. So I am steeped in the work of writing with young authors and contending with questions around who tells our stories, how do we tell them well, how do we craft powerful and resonant narratives. And so I am really interested in all of the work you do in your own writing practice and thinking about the ways in which it applies to some of the work we're doing with young authors here in the city. But to start, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself, and really a question I think that would be interesting to start with is, what draws you to the stories that you find that you most typically write about? Start with you, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Denko, and I write, in January I will have published 15 books for kids.
Amazing.
And my most recent book came out May 8th. It's called Al Capone Throws Me a Curve. It is the fourth and probably last in the series. It started with Al Capone Does My Shirts. What draws me to stories, I get a lot of ideas for stories, but the ones that I end up pursuing are the ones that just bug me to death, the ideas that won't let go. They're like little dogs that take a bite of your ankle and you just cannot get rid of them. You know, they may not be the best idea, I think, but you know, what I think and that kind of visceral reaction, the visceral reaction always wins. And then once I get started, I get possessed about reading and finding out as much as I can about the idea because I'm just too excited about it.
Thanks, Jennifer.
I'm Christopher Curtis. I have been writing, I got a real shock. It's been for 25 years now. I've been writing longer than I've been doing anything else. I'd worked in a car factory in Flint, Michigan for 13 years. I thought that was the longest I'd ever do of anything. But I've been fortunate enough to become an author. And the way I get my stories, I sit down and I have a conversation. I come up with a character and the two of us will start talking. And I'll start to write down a little bit of dialogue. It always starts with dialogue. I always do it with pen and paper. My first two books were written totally by hand. Didn't have a computer at the time. And so I'll have this conversation. And after I realize it's sort of like an interviewing process. I'm trying to find out, is this the person I want to tell the story through? And after I'll reject some, and then the others I'll find interesting, and I'll go with them. And then after that, it's just a matter of sitting down, going every day, and calling up the person that I was talking with and having this conversation. And I can tell I've really got the story when I sit down, and it's not a matter of having to draw the person up. They're right there, and they're telling me what's going on right away. And the great thing about it is the story usually doesn't go where I think it's going. I have to listen to the person who's telling me what to do.
Can I ask just really briefly,
Sure.
Did you find that your engagement with the writing practice changed once you started using a computer versus handwriting the whole piece?
Good question. Because I delayed it using the computer because the writing is different, I found, when I was doing it by computer. Because when you do it by hand, it's much slower. And I found that I was having more time to go deeper into the characters and the things. But then by the time my third book came around, it was like 3 or 4 months late, and I had to, we couldn't delve too deep anymore.
That's never happened to me.
It was actually like years late, so. But,
in author years, 3 or 4 months.
yeah, that's right. So I finally did that, and I got to the point. But superstition or whatever it is, I always start out by writing the first chapter, the first part of every chapter I do by hand. And then, and it's good to do that because one of the advantages is you can go back and see where things went wrong if they go wrong. You can say, okay, this was the spot where this should have happened instead of that.
Yep. That's great. Thank you. Brian.
My name's Brian Floka. I write and illustrate picture books, I think probably for a slightly younger audience than everyone else here. And it's different for every book. I guess for the books that I write and illustrate myself, sometimes I illustrate other people's stories. I often get interested in a journey or a place and questions of how people got to those places, whether it's the first transcontinental railroad or the first landing on the moon. And usually there's some moment within that story that I come across that feels very sort of real and solid to me. And I find myself then wanting to flesh out the rest of that journey and the rest of that process. And it's probably something that I don't understand when I start making the book. So making the book is a way of exploring for myself something that I'm interested in. So rather than the old advice, write what you know, it's a matter of writing about what you want to know, of getting curious about something, and then using the book-making process sort of as an excuse for learning and writing and drawing.
So the writing and drawing, you're engaged in both aspects of telling the story through those media. how do they interact with one another? Are you writing first and then illustrating, or are they?
It toggles back and forth a lot. I think, and I don't know if this is an experience other authors have, but when you're starting off with a book, I feel like, I get these little sort of islands of solid ground, and those for me are probably both visual and verbal. And then I try to find other little islands, and then I try to find ways to connect them and get them in the right order. Now I've mixed metaphors because you can't rearrange islands. But
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jim.
I'm Jim Murphy. Great to see you, even though the lights are
it's a little bright
up here. Anyway, well, we're sure you're there. So anyway, I went to college and graduated with an English major, mostly because I finished up all the credits when I was a junior. And then I could just take any courses I wanted to, and most of them were history courses. Then I decided I wanted to go into children's books. And back then, most of the jobs I was going for were to be secretaries. And one of the unfortunate things is I couldn't type. Still can't type. I'm also a really bad speller, and grammar, I'm very creative. And then I had to work. I worked a bit on skyscrapers in New York City as an iron worker. And then I saw somebody fall off the building, so I decided it was time to get out. And I did get a job at Clarion Books, which back then was called Seabury Press. And that was in 1970, so anybody who can do math quickly can figure that one out. I was their managing editor. I started as a secretary, and then became the managing editor. And then 8 years later, I don't know why I did this. I decided, you're getting a little old here, and one day you're going to wake up, and you're going to be 65, and it's going to be too late to write a book. So I quit. I just quit my job and had $500 in the bank and just said, that's it, we're finished. And luckily, my wife was very understanding and said, okay. So since then, I've been just sitting at home writing. And I think I've written 35 or 40 books, but I have no idea how many. And research, everything I do is fueled by research, because if I could make a living just doing the research, that's what I would do. The writing is too painful. But I love doing it. It takes, as Brian mentioned, you go on a journey. And what I do is I'm obsessive with it. I write mostly narrative nonfiction. I do write some fiction, but one of the rules I have is nothing goes in any of my books, nonfiction books, that isn't absolutely true and that I've verified, at least with 2 sources. So whenever I mention doing research to my 2 sons, one is 21 now, one's 27, they usually nod off and fall asleep, which is fine, but to me it's an exciting, amazing thing, and I stick with a project as long as I'm finding new things out about it. And I have to do that because I usually research most of my nonfiction books for 5 years at least, so before I start writing. So that's quickly.
You were saying backstage that you would identify as a deliberate researcher, right? So that you take your time with that process. And I'm wondering, does the project dictate what you're researching, or do you just dive into something you're curious about and that tells you what the story is ultimately going to be?
I start with a general overview of a subject, and I read anything I can that gives me an overview. And then I find little avenues that I become fascinated with, and it's detective work. I go hunting for clues, and I'll go anywhere to hunt them out. There's a book that I did called The Great Fire, and I read a footnote in a really obscure book, which was interesting. which said that after the Great Fire, even with all the property burnt down, the property prices went up dramatically, and that it forced a lot of poorer people out of the inner city. I mean, what was, the city at that point. And so I began researching real estate values and property values in Chicago for that whole decade. And that was 6 months of just reading stuff, which no one else has probably read ever.
You could make a killing if you could just direct these energies to
Something.
real estate today.
So that, you get interested, and then you have to stay interested, and I'm a little nuts.
That helps. Oh, that actually brings me back to something I wanted to return to that you said, Jennifer, which is this idea of becoming possessed by what you're studying. And thinking about the four of you here, it occurred to me that you're writing about places and people that exist or have existed, right? And so I'm curious about, as you dive deep into the research and you think about how you're going to convey these stories, what ethical obligations do you feel that you have in telling the stories of other people or other places that have existed? I'll pose it to you first, Jennifer.
Well, I have Al Capone in a lot of my books, and it was interesting, just a segue here. I went to the National Archives in San Bruno and looked up Al Capone's records and read his letters, and his letters sound like, a kindergarten teacher who had eaten too many donuts. They are so sugary. It's just unbelievable.
Sugary in what way?
Oh, just dear, sweet, all these like really old lady kind of words. I mean, it was just so strange. But anyway, okay. So I guess, my only obligation has been to him, and I make him look better than I think he really was. So I feel like, he's, his whole family should be thanking me.
And how do you make that decision to really show the best facets of a person? What brings you to that place?
Well, I'm really not interested in totally bad or totally good people, so I'm interested in the spectrum because it just makes much more interesting characters, and most of us are on that spectrum.
Yep.
And so I guess it sort of worked with the story, and I do, tend to think the best of people, so I cut him a little slack. Should I have done that? That's debatable.
Yeah. Do you feel the same way, Christopher?
Yeah, I do. My feelings about this have kind of evolved as I've been writing. I feel that I have an obligation in that there are not a lot of books that are being published that are really about African Americans. And when I wrote the first two, it wasn't on my mind. I was just telling stories, which is good. I was telling stories that I could relate. But now I do feel as though I have an obligation to get the little details right about what's going on, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there that I want young people who read what I've written and adults to kind of make sure that they have things right, to make sure that they know that a lot of the stereotypes that we just take for granted, and I think all of us do, we don't even realize it a lot of times. We're being conditioned to react to these stereotypes. I want to make sure that I don't have that in there. And I can do that by, I divide my writing into two different things. I have a creative period, and then I have an editorial period. And during the creative period, I just let the story go where it wants to. And then the editorial period is when which is usually, I wake up at 5 o'clock every morning, and that's when I usually do the rewriting and the trying to turn it into a story, what I've written. So I'll go back through and make sure that this is right, because a lot of times when you just writing creatively, you get a lot of anachronisms, and so I have to go back and do it that way. But I do feel an obligation to young readers, because I've had teachers come up to me and say, so-and-so, my student, really was the first book they read, and they really liked it. And I felt like that kind of placed a burden on me.
Yeah.
Not a burden, but a responsibility.
Yep.
And so I do take that obligation seriously.
Has it ever fundamentally changed the story you were trying to tell when you shifted from the creative generation to editing and making sure that it's accurate and that it contends with stereotypes or breaks down stereotypes?
No, I've never gotten to the point where the story has changed fundamentally. It's minor things, but the minor things add up over a period of time.
Yeah.
So.
Do you have an example of like a minor thing that might have changed?
Oh, okay. Here's something that's very interesting. When I was writing The Mighty Miss Malone, I have readers. I have people that I give the book to read, and you learn who you can trust. You learn who you can give it to and say, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You know who you can trust. Yeah. And I'd given it to my younger sister, my sister who's 11 months younger than I am, and I always kind of thought of her as a okay.
Yeah.
But in The Mighty Miss Malone. No, this is the latest book, The Journey of Little Charlie. The slave catcher, the sharecropper, sees a black girl, and there's an African-Canadian boy who's very much in love with this girl. And he says, she looked, I can see why he was attracted to her, because she was kind of pretty. And then he said, for a colored girl. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I gave it to my sister, and she was very worked up about that, and she said, one of the things she said was, I don't want any little black girls to be reading this somewhere, and then you're giving ammunition to someone else to say, for a colored girl. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things that I did change.
Feeling that responsibility as
an author. Feeling the responsibility, and for the readers.
Yep. Thank you for sharing that. Brian.
Yeah, I think you feel a responsibility for the people you're writing about. I think you feel a responsibility to the book itself, in a sense. The book becomes what you're trying to serve, in a sense, while you're making it. And part of making the book is part of learning what it wants and needs. So you're sort of trying to learn your way around a landscape that you're creating as you're creating it.
Can you speak specifically to that? Like can you think of an example of when the story took you in a different direction than you were expecting?
When I was making Locomotive, which is a story about a family taking a trip on the very first transcontinental railroad, that book actually started off with me. I started working on that book after I'd made a book about the first moon landing, and I really wanted to do something simpler. And so I wrote for myself a very simple book about a family just on a train trip, and it was really just how does a steam locomotive work. And then after you finish the book, you forget how much trouble it is. So after a little while, I thought, this is a little too simple. What else could I do with this? And so I just sort of set that train on the Transcontinental Railroad, thinking that would add another layer, and it added a lot of layers. And it even became not a trip about a single train, because I learned that the crews and the engines would change over the course of the ride. And so all the sort of the things that I had as through lines that were going to get the reader through the story of this journey had to change, and it became a totally different book. Yep. It became 3 or 4 different books before it became the book that it finally became.
That's such an interesting framework shift from a responsibility to characters or places that might have existed to a responsibility to the reader and to the book itself. Yeah.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Can you just speak for the Mars book and the Locomotive book, what type of specialists did you seek out for the technical parts of those?
Could we ask you to just repeat that into the microphone? Sorry.
What type of experts and specialists did you seek out for your research for the Locomotive and the Mars book?
The space book is the first moon landing. So that was moonshot. For that one, who did I find? I think I read a tremendous amount for that one. I did try to send it to some of the astronauts before it came out, but I think they hear from a lot of people. So, but it's funny. So you can send them a stack of paper and you won't hear back, but then when you actually send them the book after it's too late to change anything. Well, now it's a book, and they'll write back. And for that one, but I did hear back from some of them. And anyway, and then for Locomotive, I ran it by curators of railroad museums. There's a railroad museum out in Nevada, and there's the Central Pacific Railroad Museum in California. And so I ran drafts by them. And then all of this you're running by your editor at the same time, who is not just, as I think some on school visits, I learned that there are kids who think the editor is just the person who makes you change your lousy grammar or take out the things that you really want in the story. But what the editor really serves as is sort of an intelligent, critical friend who is trying to help you make the book that you want to make, the best book that you can make. And also, I think when you're writing nonfiction, is also someone who's going to ask critical questions when they feel like a step has been missed or something doesn't add up and doesn't make sense. So that's an important part of the process, too.
Yeah, I think to anybody out there and to the young people who want to be an editor, don't do it. It's got to be the worst job in the world. And I always thought my editor, I was her only author, and then I'd gone in her office one time, and there are just these stacks. There's a stack of manuscripts like this, and that was from Gary Paulson alone.
But you get to work with people like us, so it's...
Yeah, that's true. But the editor has to know how to handle the author. Authors have different kinds of personalities, different kinds of quirks. You have to know how to do that. You have to know how to make the story better. You have to be able to, I think one of the real skills of being an editor is that you have to read the book again and again and again with fresh eyes, because a joke after you've heard it 8 or 9 times, it's just not funny anymore, and you lose that. So don't do it. Don't become an editor.
Well, imagine you just have to have an incredible capacity for investment. Like, you have to be invested in so many different stories that your authors are telling in order to see it with fresh eyes constantly. It's a high bar.
It is. It really is.
Jim?
Well, I'll second, don't become an editor. I was an editor. And I never took vacations. I worked 8 years, and I actually took 2 vacations, so that's a bit of a lie. But I never took vacations, never took sick leaves. I would read all the time, on the bus going home, on the weekends, all the time. And in my office, and of course, then you get to work on manuscripts, and you're right, we were a tiny little publishing house, and we got 5,000 manuscripts a year. When I became a writer, I got hired by just about every publishing house in New York City to read theirs. And once I worked for Scholastic, and they said, "Oh, here are the manuscripts. We fell behind." I said, "How far behind are you?" And they said, "Well, we have about 5,000, and you need to get these out within a month." And I said, "Okay." I said, "These are going to be really short reports." And they said, "Well, you also have to type the rejection letters." And they gave me a manual typewriter that was broken, so I had to, this is really true, and I had to make it work with paper clips. But I got it done. I got the work done, and I found 2 manuscripts.
Out of the 5,000?
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if they were ever published, quite frankly, but they were better. They were good enough that someone should take a look at it. I did the same thing for Seabury Press, and my friend, Jim Giblin, was the editor, and he called me one Friday and said, "Can you get in here? We're moving tomorrow, and I have 300 manuscripts, and I need them read and put in an envelope and sent before the night's out." And I did find a book that was published. It was Steve Mannis's Be a Perfect Person, and another one. And
These are horror stories.
Yeah, I mean, this has gone in a very different
but
direction.
here's the thing. I loved editing. I never disliked 1 minute of it. And I liked writing those weird diplomatic letters.
Yeah.
I was good.
Do you have any tips? Do you have any tips for how to relate that kind of information?
What, how to reject a manuscript?
Yeah.
We're not here to tell these people how to reject our work.
Well, but you have to. you have to be very careful with some authors, as you heard, and some of them are really, really tense. So I went in once to talk to Jim Giblin again about, because I was doing freelance for them on a weekly basis, and he said, oh, we sent so-and-so your notes, and we let her know that you did the notes. And I said, oh, how'd she react? And he said, well, she put them in her freezer, and they're still there. And I said, those are really good notes. He says, yeah, I know. He says, we're going to get her to thaw them out.
For preservation.
We'll get her to work on it. But, you just have to, there's kind of a minefield, possibly. So you have to sort of, and what I did is I always assumed that whatever the manuscript was, the person who wrote it, I do have one qualification here, but for the most part, they were trying to be very honest and straightforward, and that they're literally putting their heart out to you. And that includes, once I read a manuscript, which I actually wasn't bad, and it was about a red rubber ball that was bouncing down a hill, came to a red traffic light and fell in love with the red light, and then would just sit bouncing, waiting for the red light to come back. And I walked into Jim Giblin and said, Jim, was that you? Jim, this is the weirdest manuscript, but you got to read this. So I give it to him, and I go in my office, and I just hear him laughing, hysterical. And he said, oh my goodness, write him a nice letter. So anyway, you're trying to, as I said, I'm obsessive about research. I read as many primary sources as I can, because I want to know what the voices are of the people I'm writing about. And that kind of forms the basis, but I generally, when I start a book, have no concept whatsoever of what's going to happen, or what the themes are, or anything. It kind of evolves. I try to do it like a story, but carefully.
And you were talking earlier about like the difference of when you're writing a story about yourself, too, like really looking deliberately at making sure the details are right about your own story.
Right. No, I feel a deep obligation to the people I'm writing about, but also to the readers, and also to the subject matter, because I tend to tell the truth when possible, and I get in trouble for that all the time. And, and editors sometimes say, Jim, you can't use this photograph. They're all like rotting corpses. I said, that's what war is. I'm sorry, but you got to put it in.
Yeah.
And we have these back and forths all the time. And I'm very patient. I just kind of present my case and hope for the best. But you can tell some very hard truths if you use first-person accounts, because those people were trying to be honest, and they were actually, if for instance, I've done a bunch of books on Civil War. If they're writing home, they're actually self-censoring, and they're telling about a horrible, horrible incident, but they're not telling all of the truths. So you can do that, and you have to be very careful, though, because I don't want to scare anybody off.
Does that resonate with anyone else, this idea that you're having to advocate for the truth and sometimes there's pushback?
Well, one issue I've had is, what is the truth? Because whoever writes a book, that is considered the authority, but that may not be the truth.
Yep.
And you can have two sources that actually came from that same book, and that book can be erroneous. And even though I write historical fiction, I want to know what the truth is. And so that's always the first question that I ask, and it's a surprisingly difficult question to answer.
Because it's so nuanced.
Well, because, then you start interviewing firsthand sources, and they didn't write a book, but they have very different views of what happened. So if you're going to, publish something, and librarians are going to check the book. They're not going to check the sources, and so it becomes very tricky.
Yep, I can imagine.
Somebody mentioned part of the editor's job and who reads your manuscripts first. So my wife reads everything I write first, and my agent. And they're both nasty. They're nasty editors. And you know, my agent, I just did a book about a girl in the Civil War, fiction. And she called me up and starts yelling at me, and she said, "You do this in every book you ever write. You kill off the main characters. Why do you keep doing it?" I said, "She's not dead. You don't know that." You know. So then she said, "You're going to have to do something about that." So you get that kind of feedback, and then I look for experts. So I go anywhere, and my mother taught me to you're going to get rejected a lot, but why not ask? Just get ready. So I write to and call, get in touch with really famous people all the time.
Yeah.
A lot of times they'll call me directly because they know I didn't come to them kind of going, well, I don't know anything about this subject. I've actually done some work, and they can talk to me about it.
I also think you realize that while you're trying to get everything in your book right, you also realize you're not necessarily going to be, and you're also not obligated to write the definitive history of your subject.
Yes.
You know, you're also writing for a young reader. So to write about the first moon landing, part of my job was not to say everything. Part of my job was to create something that felt distilled enough to create what felt meaningful to me about that journey. So, you know, I'm really giving the reader why this is important to me.
Yep.
And I'm not doing that with the idea that, okay, this kid's going to, or adult, whoever reads the book is going to read this and then be done with reading about the moon landing or the space program. And it's sort of a liberating thing to realize that, and to realize you have an obligation to the truth, but you're not going to write. I mean, you can make a career out of writing about any of the things that we have written about in a single book. You know, so you want to start a reader down a path of being interested in the subject, and that's going to lead them to find other books about the subject that illuminate other corners of it, that maybe from somebody who feels differently about the subject than you do. You know,
Yeah.
so you want to get them. You're not checking a box for the reader. You want to get a process started for the reader.
Right. I wanted to just agree completely. And when people say, what kind of books do you write? I say, I don't write history books, I write experience books, because what I want are my readers to enter the world of the past and experience it almost as if they're there. And that's half of the fun I have, is trying to see if I can do it. And it works better with some subjects and some individuals than others.
Because it's really, like, a lot of history has really been pressed and drained by the time it gets salted and dried by the time it gets to the reader. But if you can put the blood back in it, and
well, that's
show
the way
that
the
it's
first-hand
story.
accounts. That's where their voices can be very helpful.
And to what you said, Brian, I feel like when I'm writing to somebody, when I'm telling the story, I wanted to, the thing that I've been asked, what do you want your books to do with kids? I want it to be like the first step, like what you said. I want this, to read about this, and then to say, you know, I feel like I've been successful if the young reader says, okay, why did people act like this and that way? And that'll send them on to either another piece of fiction or to nonfiction, something where they can get into a history book and find out what the answers are. And on the truth, it's hard. It's like what Jennifer said, what is the truth? It varies and it changes over time and with different perceptions. So I think your obligation is to get it as real and honest as you can within yourself.
And like, I just had the pleasure of reading Bud Not Buddy, and that book opens all these doors and gives you all these looks into these different worlds, into the bands and the travel and the Depression and the strikes and the Hoovervilles, and it's not a history of Hoovervilles, because as a 10-year-old, I don't know if I want to read that. Maybe I do, but now I'm curious about it because I've seen someone sort of live that moment.
When I write it, I write it from the perspective of a young person. They don't care about the economic causes of that, and hopefully the older readers can see the results of what has happened because of the Depression, things that maybe the younger people won't see.
This is bringing me to another question I have for you all. You had talked earlier, Christopher, about learning who you can trust. as sounding boards or sources of feedback. And as I'm thinking about these books being invitations for further inquiry in your readers, I'm wondering, to what extent are your readers sources of feedback for you all?
You mean once a book is published?
Yeah, and they reach back out to you and say, this resonated with me, or this is a critique I have. Does that happen at all?
Oh, yeah. I did have a funny instinct. I wrote a book called Across America on an Immigrant Train, which is a much more interesting book than that title sounds. And they did a map of the United States, the publisher, on the inside cover. I never saw it before it went to publication. And literally 6 months later, a letter arrives from some boy from New Hampshire and said, "You switched New Hampshire and Vermont.
Oh.
It doesn't, that's not," and I'm going, "Oh, give me a gun and I will shoot." And then he's of course pointing to me and saying, "Here's what you did, kid." So I wrote back and I didn't say, I didn't do it. I said, "I'm going to try to make this right." And so I sent him, they did make it right, and I sent him a copy, and I said, "Thank you for letting me know."
Go I.
But in a sort of larger sense, I think it's actually it's tricky to try to write for a reader. I think you end up, there's a greater risk of faking it. And I think what readers ultimately really respond to is when they sense that the book has been meaningful for the author, which is not always sufficient, but it's probably necessary.
Yep.
And if you create something that feels real to you and that you've fallen in love with yourself, that shoots through the work and reaches the reader. And I think that's a very personal process and not something that's very easily outsourced.
I find, I didn't mean to interrupt, I apologize, but I find going to schools and talking to kids much more informative, because they can be just very direct about your book, but sometimes, mostly very nice too. But I listen to the questions they have about subjects, and when I'm writing, I often imagine that I'm literally talking to a kid, right across the table from me, and I'm trying to say, you're smart enough, and this is complicated, but I can write it in a way that you will not need pages and pages of explanation. You'll get it as fast as I can get it to you. Because I was not a reader at all till I got to around 7th grade. I didn't read many books.
Can I ask Jennifer a question? Weren't you worried that you weren't writing for your readers when you wrote Al Capone Does My Shit?
I never write for readers.
Yeah.
I write for myself completely. I agree with you because I would be disingenuous because I don't know what a reader thinks. I know what I think, and I'm 12. I know I don't look 12, but I am inside, and so somehow it comes out. Other people who are 12 respond. I don't know. So yeah, I agree with you.
I think it's a dangerous thing to react to things like that. It's like with reviews. I don't react to the good ones, and I don't react to the bad ones, because you never know. You never know who the person is, what their qualifications are, even if they've read it properly. So I take things in, and I think you get a little bit. If you take a little bit out of each thing that you take in, then maybe you can use it. But particularly from when I hear from students, most of the times I think you're going to hear, "Oh, I really liked it." I don't think I've ever had a young person come up to me and say, "Your last book stank." So I think that the things that you're going to get have been kind of been censored already, because people don't like to give you bad news, other than editors.
Yeah.
But you were talking also, when you shared it with your sister, right? And so I'm curious about that process for all of you. is it a series of sort of micro negotiations with yourself, which pieces of feedback you're parsing out in order to maintain an authentic story that is aligned with your own curiosity, the story you want to tell? Like, how do you contend with that process of receiving feedback?
That's where the editor, once again, I think is so important. Because if you can if you trust your editor, you know, if you guys are on the same plane and you know that she's saying something to you, and I say she because it's like 98% of them are women. If you can understand that and you trust what she says, you take it in. I tell young people that my relationship with my editor is in many ways like their relationship with their English teacher if they're smart. And I think I'm smart enough to know that, for example, Wendy Lamb knows more about certain things than I do, and that she's looking at the book in a way that I don't look at it. You know, she's looking at it from a lot of different areas, like for sales and or how this is, you know, this might be offensive to whatever. So I trust her, and I think once you can develop that kind of a relationship, then I think that's really all the kind of the input you need. And I think anything else it's nice to hear, but you have to be very careful with how seriously you take it.
And I think trust is really the magic word there, because you feel very. It's a very exposing thing to give someone something you've been working on that you know is not as good as it should be or as you want it to be. And like, oh, here, read this and tell me what's wrong with it.
They're meant to be personal experiences, so you take things personally, even when you know, oh, how could I miss that? You know, that was a silly question that I should have answered myself.
I once got a 27-page letter from my editor, and really it could have been just said with "start over." But I got the message. It was so diplomatic. Oh my God. I felt bad for her. Why couldn't she just say "start over"? Anyway.
We're learning a lot about letter writing etiquette on this panel, by the way. I did not realize that was going to be objective. Sorry to interrupt.
But I also have a critique group, and I bring chapters of what I'm working on, because it's a while before I am ready to send something to my editor. And that can be helpful, you know, because all of a sudden, you know, they'll really respond to some character who, you know, I like, but I didn't realize, you know, how everybody in the room really glommed onto that one character. And it can help as I'm formulating the book. Sometimes I haven't been in a critique group. It sort of depends where I am and what book I'm writing, and you know, I have to feel safe about a chapter to even bring it at all. But I like getting that kind of feedback. My husband used to be my first reader, but that was hard on our marriage.
Is there usually one first reader? Is that occupied by one particular individual for all of you? No.
I'm in a shared studio, which I feel really lucky for. I share my studio with 4 other we're down to 3 actually. 3 other don't ask authors and illustrators, and we give each other a glimpse every now and then. But I think we work primarily with our editors before we work with each other, even though we're sort of cheek to jowl in this space. I think that's my first reader.
I haven't had a lot of. I've been in one writing group, and that was very early on, before any of my books had been published, and I just didn't like the experience. You don't know where the person's coming from, and there was a lot of the criticism that I felt like was just not on target. That was kind of petty, and then, you know, then cliques developed, and it was just so. My editor is my first, usually the first person who reads it. And it's like what you said. I used to hate getting the letters, the first editorial letter. Kids would say, "What's the worst part about being a writer?" I said, "Getting that editorial letter," and it would sit for a week before I'd open it. And it was I couldn't open it. I just couldn't open it. And then I finally opened it, and I knew what the pattern was. The first 2 or 3 pages, 20-some page long letter. First 2 or 3 pages. Oh, this is great! Wow! And then the last slice you to shreds.
I knew I was in trouble with that 27-page letter, because the part that's usually the good part, that was about my other books.
Danger.
Yeah. Ooh.
in the
Oh, sure. Oh, yes. Could we grab the microphone real quick? There, right there. Would you mind just asking your question into the microphone? Thank you.
Published 2 books, and I am currently working on a novel, but I am trying to transition from self-publishing to finding an agent and a trusted agent to read my material, shop it around and all of that. What suggestion would you give to accomplish that?
Are you a member of SCBWI? Okay, it's Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. They have conferences, and they also have a website that's really informative. They can help you figure that out, because just knowing which editor has changed houses and all of that, keeping track of that is difficult. I always recommend that you both look for an agent and an editor at the same time, because they're both hard to get, and you don't know which one is going to pop.
They are. It's become increasingly hard to get published, I think. My first book came out 20-some years ago, and it was hard then because all the publishers were gobbling each other up, and you had very few options. I entered contests. I don't know if you've gone to Writers Market. Have you been to Writers Market? It's a book about this thick, and it's got lots of different editors at each publishing house. It has contests. I entered contests with my first ones to get it read. And one of the things you have to do, you have to take chances. And because some of the time you get lucky, and I got very lucky with my first book, because I sent it in, and the editor who read it was intrigued by, she read a little bit of it. She was intrigued by the title, actually. And so she read a little bit of it, and then it didn't win the contest, but they published it. And if it had gone to some other editor, who knows what would have happened. Right. It's a crapshoot in a lot of ways. So you just have to have a thick skin and just keep doing it and keep trying to sending stuff out.
Because we've talked about how much time the editors spend with the manuscript. So it's not just a question of, is my book good enough? I mean, I guess on some level it's that question, but it's also a question of finding someone who wants to work intimately with it for 6 months or more.
Other questions?
How did you find your editors?
Are you a member of SCBWI?
I found mine through the contest. I entered the contest, and the editor who read it, Wendy Lamb, is a very senior editor. And in contests and things, you usually don't get that. You get very junior editor, low level, and they're afraid of anything. They don't want to say this is good and look bad, so everything is bad to them. But go to Writers Market again, and they have lists of different editors and how you can get in touch with them. What do you write?
Whenever I really feel it, it kind of pops up in my
Fantasy?
That's good.
I love it.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll write about this? Okay, good.
Any other responses to this question of how you find your editors?
I had sort of 3 lucky breaks all in one. When I was in school, I got to take a class with an author and illustrator named David Macaulay, and he introduced me to the author Avi, and that led to a project with Avi's editor, Richard Jackson, and that was how I met my editor. And I guess the only useful thing I can give you out of that is something you're already doing, which is if you're interested in publishing and writing and drawing, put yourself in places where you will meet people and get to hopefully find some of those opportunities.
Or send a letter to David Macaulay, because he helped me get my first book published.
No,
too.
really?
I took a class with him, and there we go.
Wow.
At RISD?
At RISD.
We should talk.
Yeah.
We should be on a panel together.
Question?
What do you think was your hardest book to write and why?
Well, I think my hardest one was when I got that letter that said start over. Because usually I work on the wreckage of the previous draft. And maybe I don't keep, I never keep the whole thing, but maybe I keep 20 or 30% of the draft, and then and that's how I kind of build the book. But that one I had to just start totally over, and it was daunting. It was the first time I thought, I might have to give the advance back. But I kind of dug deeper, and I'm really proud of the book that came out. I really feel like I'm so glad that the whole process happened the way it did, because I ended up with a much better book that I, feel really good about.
Mm-hmm. My hardest book to write was The Mighty Miss Malone. And I think the reason it was the hardest was writing is like anything else that you do. The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And I was doing it kind of here and there. I'd do a little bit and I'd stop. And I found out that writing is a lot like a physical activity, that you get in shape for it, that you get to a certain point where things are really humming. And if you pull back and stop, then you got to go back in and work out all over again and get in shape again. The easiest one I did was Elijah of Buxton, which it's one of them that I'm the most proud of. And it took me 6 months to do that, and that's very, very short for me. And it's because the character came very quickly to me, and it was very easy to put down what he had to say.
Mine was a book about George Washington, and I got so involved in writing it and getting every detail in that I could think of that it ended up just a little over 400 pages long with about 120 pages of notes. Sent it to my editor, who did not respond for months. And so I I just tend to, if they don't respond, I'll do something else. So I didn't mind too much. But I got in touch with her, and she said, I'm about halfway through it. And I said, well, this doesn't sound good. And I said, you need to just cut to the chase, because clearly it needs a lot of work. And she actually said something that was really very helpful. She said, look, who's the star of this? It's George Washington. He's in a movie. Make sure he's in the movie, not buried in details. And I said, that's all I need. And I went back to my this is where computers are great. I went back to my computer, and all I did was go down paragraphs, and anything that wasn't about George Washington, I deleted. And in the first day, I cut easily 150 pages. I mean, it was painful to do, because I really worked on all those pages. But, after a while, I had a much shorter manuscript, and then I had to rewrite the whole thing to make it all sound.
One of my writer friends says that when you take something out of your manuscript that you just love, put it on your refrigerator, and then every time you walk by, you say, oh, that was such a smart little chapter that I deleted.
Do you do that, Jennifer?
No.
Brian, do you have a response? Hardest?
Oh, they're all so hard. I mean, and the funny thing is, you do it a few times, then you feel like, oh, I've done this a few times, the next one will be easy. But it's just like learning how to do it all over again every time you start. And you ultimately, I think, just have to trust the process, that if you get back, if you get yourself back in shape again, I can do this again. Yep. Yeah.
Other questions right now?
Thank you.
It's all right. I feel like a rock star this way. I was going to ask, so we're all here today because you tell stories about American history in some way. What draws you to telling those stories, and what's your value in that history?
I think one of the things that draws me is that I want to tell. Growing up, I was a really good reader. I was a really good reader. I don't know how many of you remember the old SRA boxes that were at the back of the classroom, where it started out in primary colors, and then it got. I was reading from Plaid when I was in the 6th grade. But I was a good reader, but I didn't like to read books. I'd read Mad Magazine, I'd read comic books, I'd read Time, I'd read Newsweek. I'd read anything but books. So, and now I've forgotten the question.
Your value
Oh, so I think that the reason that I didn't like books was there weren't books that were for, by, or about people like me. Not to say that African American people need to read African American books and so on like that, but I think that for a book to really grab you, there has to be something of you in it, something that you can identify with. So I want to tell stories that I think I would have wanted to read when I was 10, 11, 12 years old.
My father loved to write. It wasn't his job, but he loved to write, and he loved history. And there were history books, California history, everywhere in our house. And I thought I wasn't, I liked history, but it didn't seem to be my thing. I kind of backed into it. I just got this idea that, that led me to do historical fiction, and then I found out how fun it was. And I started to look, well, I love reading it. Why wouldn't I love writing it? So sometimes it's really, for me, it's idea-driven rather than history-driven.
I think I'm interested in it because I think as a lot of people first encounter with history is in this very sort of dry form, but it's something that animates so quickly with just a little bit of care and attention. And then once you've done that, there are these sort of alternate dimensions all around us, these layers to our story that we're all just sort of sitting on. And you don't, once you start looking at them and realizing that, you look at an old black and white photograph from the past, from when people were obligated to stay very still for the film speed, and things look very quiet and dull. But you give those people half a chance, and they come to life, and they're loud, and their history is loud and full of conflict and change. The era of the Transcontinental Railroad, before the steam locomotive came along, the fastest you could travel over land was as fast as an animal could carry you or pull you, and that had been true for 10,000 years since animals had been domesticated. And then suddenly there comes this machine that can take you across a continent in a week. We can barely understand what that kind of change would have been like. People had this expression, steam annihilates time and space. So we tend to think of the past as this packaged still thing, but if you take the time to try to visit it, you see how full of energy and life and stories it is. And so I like the idea that that's really all around us, and it's there waiting for us to pay attention to it.
I like surprises. And so when I do research and I'm coming across little pieces of information, I'm going, oh, that's kind of cool, or it's weird, or it's gross. I was once in the Newark Library, which was very underfunded years and years ago, and I was doing research on something completely unrelated when I saw a book sitting on one of the big tables, and it was open wide, and it just stayed there all day. And they didn't even have enough staff to really do anything. Now, any librarians out there are going to hate this story because I went over, picked the book up, looked at the call number, and went searching for it, in the stacks. And I found it, and I found the space was still there. And I was putting it back, and I thought, I wonder what this book's about. I didn't even look at it. So I opened it up, and it was a memoir done by Private Elijah Stockton. And there's a photo inside that book, and it was of this little kid in a big baggy Civil War uniform. And I thought, I didn't know kids this young actually were soldiers. So I took that book out and went home and read it. And Elijah was immensely funny. He ended up a captain. He was a sergeant by the time he was 16 or 17. I discovered that happened because everybody else in the company were getting killed off. So everyone goes up in rank, and lots of kids did that. The drummer boys, were suddenly sergeants, and they were in their early teens. So I just thought, now if I didn't know this, I'll bet a bunch of kids might not know this, and it might be fun to do a book. So that started, I did research for 7 years on that book. And what you do is, you asked, a question came up about where do you get help. You know, I called every place, including the Museum of the Confederacy, and they were great because they said, we have thousands of untranslated letters from the Civil War. And I say, untranslated? And they said, oh, nobody can read them. It's all squiggly. Mm-hmm. So I went down and sat for days reading those letters and finding, you know, kids who were writing home. And so you just, it's, again, I kept being surprised.
Mm. Go ahead.
How long does it take you to write your books?
Too long, according to my wife. She says, she was suggesting I write faster a number of years ago. And I said, well, you know, I'm a very deliberate researcher and writer. And she says, you're not deliberate, you're slow. Speed it up. So I tried. I'm not that good. But sometimes I did a picture book about dinosaurs, and it took me 10 years to do the research. It takes a while.
I've done nonfiction picture books where I sort of thought what was going on at the beginning of writing the book, and then as I did my research sort of happily fell in line with the outline I had in mind, and that maybe took 8 months or so. And then I've started books where I thought I knew what was going on, and then the research told me, no, I don't know anything. And I've spent 5 years on the book.
It varies from book to book, like I said, from 6 months to 4 years. And there's no set amount of time that you have to put in the book. One of the hardest things, I think, is knowing when to end the book, because you can keep writing because the story never ends. Mm. So after a while, you feel like you've made the point that you wanted to make, and it's time to end it. So usually, a year is usually what I take on a book.
Well, I guess the shortest was 30 days, and that was a picture book, and the longest, 5 years. But my novels usually take at least 2 years.
Thank you.
How far are you from the end when you sort of see it coming and realize, oh, that's where I'm headed?
I think I'm well past it. I've gone too far. I realize
you're looking back.
That bell was ringing like 5 chapters ago. So yeah, and then it's a matter of just this is where it should end. And I get a lot from kids. You left us hanging. You know, you didn't sum everything up. But they don't know, but I feel good when that happens, because that means there's still curiosity for what's going on. Because you can beat it to death otherwise.
And kids always demand a sequel, it seems like. They all want sequels to
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
We have a question over here. If you wouldn't mind using that mic right there.
Hello? Okay. You've been talking about research. And research historically is a very, and this is probably and I'm not writing, I'm thinking about writing something for children. It's a very personal, it's a very, I mean, you can go into a place with research where you are just there. And you will all alluded to it being a situation where you might have one particular approach that you think you're going to take. But there's the primary sources, there's the letters, there's all kinds of research, there's the pictorial approach. And when you start dealing with research, you're really dealing with people. You're dealing with lives. And so how do you mirror and integrate, especially for young people who don't yet quite know the overall impact of that research? And how can you make it so that it's clear for the teachers, for parents, for librarians to sort of maybe not push what your intent is, but to allow the child to begin to pick up that research is needed, that reading is important, because there's different levels into what each one of you, in terms of what your main intent is. So through all that complicated, and I cannot believe I'm never nervous.
It's okay.
Never. I think it's because all these thoughts are running through my head. Because in terms of me, for personally, research, I love, eat, sleep research. It can impact and change your lives. So when you're writing your books, you want to get to little people, or young adults, children. What's your main point? What do you want them to come away with in terms of being, by the time they're in high school, research becomes a nasty word. It becomes something that's ugly, something that you have to do to write those term papers. And so bringing children into a space and a place where they get accustomed to it, and they can integrate both the actual technique and the methodology of research and what that really means for them, and also how it becomes a part of the approach in terms of American history, which is just can go all over the place. Did any of you get what I was attempting to say?
I think research, along the lines of what Jennifer said, I write for myself. And I think like we have editors that help us. I tell teachers all the time, we're a team. And it's the teacher who can take the things that you've written about, and they know how to couch it in a way that the child will understand it. So I depend on teachers really to be able to make my stories accessible to the young people. I don't have that in mind when I'm writing to them. I'm not thinking, okay, I'm going to write this in such a way that this child's going to react to it in that way. I just write it, and I've been fortunate enough that teachers are able to translate it for me to the young people and to make it interesting to them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you've touched on one of the tricks we have to do, which is that, like we all can sort of fall into our research and get lost there, but then at the end, like what you were saying with your Washington book, what we have to do is frame it and package it and assemble it so that the kid will actually want to move through whatever we've learned.
So the framing and the packaging is what you're saying essentially.
Packaging sounds bad, doesn't it?
Does.
But we have to.
See, once again, but it's not.
We have to make a story out of it. We have to make something out of it that the reader will want to be a part of, and we can tell the kids that we love research, from dawn till dusk, but that's not going to really do that much good. What we have to do is we have to take that research and we have to turn it into something that the kid wants to spend time with. And then that message about research is not in the front anymore, maybe, but that's kind of the only way they'll get to it, I think.
I think for me, I do historical fiction, and it's a portal to nonfiction. Because they start, well, does Alcatraz exist? What's really true? Did Al Capone exist? I mean, so from that, when I speak in the schools, I always just tell the nonfiction stories because that fueled the book. And after I leave, they're checking out all these books because it's fascinating. And so I think the spark, that focus, is what you find really interesting. It's not what you think should be out there, it's what you find interesting. And that gets transferred, through your words, in between the words. And that is what lights kids' interest, I think.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Are you a teacher?
No, I'm not.
No?
I work with children a lot, and history major and genealogist. And so the two are very, I have tutored for years. So just being around children for so long and how they see their world and how we as adults have to be very, very mindful of what and how we bring information to them so that they become positive and their own self-seeking individuals. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
She's a teacher.
I should be a teacher?
I said you are a teacher.
Well, I am a teacher, yes. I am a teacher, yes. In fact, we are all teachers. Thank you.
We have one more question right here.
Yes, I'm curious, and you've kind of already touched on this, but I'm a scientist, and everything is kind of slow, steady, disciplined progress, and you're obviously very creative people, and I'm just curious what your day-to-day life looks like. Do you work in fits and starts? Do you have moments of inspiration and then get into slumps? I mean, how exactly do you function?
Can I go quickly? Fits and starts and slumps.
It's a great question, though, and like what you were saying, Christopher, around this idea that it's a practice, like it's a rigorous and sustained practice.
It is.
So what, to this question, what tips do you have around how you contend with that practice or maintain that?
You know, it's a muscle. It really is a muscle. And, you know, for a while my brother was interested in writing, and he went a little crazy trying to write because he didn't have the muscles built. So it takes time to build those muscles so you have, you know, you can spend all day writing. Now I'm at the point where I get kind of depressed if I'm not writing. So it really, it's a mental health thing. But I am very disciplined. And I have a couple of times in the day that I'm most creative, and I really get resentful if I'm spending that time writing emails or, you know, doing, you know, marketing questionnaires or whatever. And so I really try not to do that because I want that choice time for my creative work. But yeah, I love the work, and so that pulls me along. You know, it's not because I have to do it. In fact, I love researching too, but I prefer writing, so I have to make sure that I have enough. I'm kind of the opposite. I don't get lost in the research. I get lost in the writing, and then I'm like, oh no, I need more information here.
And it's not magical. You're not waiting for the muse to come. A lot of it is just sitting there and doing it and making it a regular practice. And I feel like such a hypocrite for saying that, but that's the truth. And when I'm productive, it's the times that I'm sitting down every single day, and I go back to the factory that I worked in. You had to go every day, and you had to do it. Otherwise, you don't get it done.
I suggest to a lot of students that they spend a good deal of time reading and then do a good deal of writing because Jennifer's correct, it's a skill. It's like making pots, and it doesn't work easily to begin with. And it never gets really easy for me, but I'm kind of lazy too. And I never write a lot. If I write a page I like any day, that's really a big day for me. Once I wrote 3 pages, and then I had to take a day off because I was exhausted. And then
maybe your wife is right.
Yeah, she is. No, I didn't. I never said she wasn't right. I was just trying to come up with a nice-sounding explanation. But you know, if I get bogged down at all, I will read, or I usually have a bunch of kind of ideas in works at different stages. And so sometimes I'll just shift off to looking at another subject just to see how that makes me feel. And then I take naps. I take naps every day.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
This one's for my son, who's 12. He bailed on me today, but he ran into some trouble in his English class recently dealing with his teacher and kind of getting the best kind of feedback, and I was unable to help him with that. So as writers who have dealt with editors, and I like what Mr. Christopher said about treating your English teacher as an editor. How can they maximize? How can they make the most out of that relationship? What type of questions maybe to bring to the classroom? What type of organization skill, like how to best equip a student to build that relationship. And a question from me, from Mr. Murphy, how do you take maybe a serious, very dramatic, tragic incident and relate it to maybe a young audience, to all audiences, to a children's book, to a young adult book? When is it too, I thought about when you said you saw a man fall off the building. And that was such a visceral moment. I think everyone in the audience responded to that. So if you took that moment, would that be appropriate for a children's book, or is it too dark? So those are the questions.
Thank you.
I try to be very careful with the darker elements of any of the subjects I'm writing about. That's why you have editors to kind of like say, okay, let's think this one over. And then we can usually work out something where I can soften it, or I can, get them to let it stand. You know, and sometimes you get criticism. Once I got my book about boys in the Civil War, I got 2 letters from older adults, 2 weeks apart, and one said, "You're glorifying war and children are going to die because of your book." And another person said, "This is the best anti-war book I've ever read." And, you know, my take with my editor at the time was, I want kids to get a sense of what going to war is really like, so that they're not 18 and thinking it's a video game, that real stuff happens. So, you know, I keep that in mind, but I try to be careful.
But also in terms of teachers, I mean, some teachers you have like a real connection with and some you don't. I mean, I probably wouldn't be here if I didn't have great teachers. I really did have great teachers. But there were ones along the way that I didn't really connect with. So, you know, I'm not sure that you can have like a list of things that will make that relationship. It just seems like it kind of happens.
Yeah. And you just got to get them through that bump, that hard time. I'm totally unqualified to tell how to handle a 12-year-old and make them get along with their English teacher. I can't.
Any thoughts, Brian?
No. I mean, if he can hold on to what he loves about writing, or if he can find something that he loves about writing, and I don't know if we've touched on this or not, but I think one of the reasons we are all enthusiastic researchers is that we're writing about things that we love. You know, and someone spoke earlier about how by the time you get to high school, research becomes something students don't want to do. And, you know, maybe sometimes that's because you're being asked to research something you don't want to know about, right or wrong. And, you know, you described it earlier as detective work. And it does feel, you know, once you're able to direct your research to something you want to know more about, then it is detective work. It's a treasure hunt. So I don't know what the point of entry for your son would be, but if you can find it, then yeah.
And it's fun for us because we're learning more about something that we're interested in. As he said, we're interested in this. And one of the things I hated most of all in school was doing a research paper, and it's just because you were asked to take something that you didn't care about, you weren't interested in. And there's nothing harder than writing something about something that you're not interested in. So tell him there times will change. He'll have a different teacher who might understand it in a different way.
Follow the path of curiosity.
There you go.
Sort of. Well, we are out of time, but I first just want to thank you all for spending time with us over the past 90 minutes, and also encourage you to bring any other questions you might have to our authors for the remainder of the day. Because they will be here throughout the afternoon. So thank you all, and thank you all for being so thoughtful and open with this conversation. I got a lot out of it. I'm sure everyone else did too. And thank you to the National Archives for having us here. So we'll see you upstairs, right? We'll see you upstairs. Thank you.